Our country has never faced a crisis like this. It is a conspiracy. The rule of law is under attack. An element in the government is trying to start a war with a foreign nation. Politicians are trying to usurp power and install themselves in positions of power. The president refuses to hand over documents. There are allegations that the president is targeting political opponents. We should be scared for the very safety of our nation and the sanctity of its institutions. March 11th, 2017? No, that was the scene in 1809. Thomas Jefferson refused to testify regarding his former Vice President Aaron Burr. Burr stood trial on charges of treason, that he was working with Spain to start a war in Texas and the Southern Territories, that there was also the possibility he might have become leader of this new nation. One of the key issues was whether his arrest was politically motivated. Thomas Jefferson had written letters that may have shed some light on that, but he invoked his executive privilege and refused to disclose their contents. Sitting in as trial judge, none other than Chief Supreme Court Justice John Marshall subpoenaed Jefferson, stating, "Courts should issue subpoenas based on the character of the information sought, not the character of the person who holds it." Naturally, Jefferson disagreed. But for the good of country, and because he knew the dangers of a constitutional showdown, he released the documents. Burr was acquitted, and the nation survived this early constitutional crisis. While the case tested our young nation, the standards and laws that had been put in place only a few decades before prevailed. This morning we read from Tetzaveh, which sets forth some of the standards and laws of our Jewish tradition. The portion sets out the requirements for the clothing worn by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. In the Torah, we learn about the exacting specifications of the garment. It is to have among its beautiful features fibers of wool and linen. Alone, this describes a garment not unlike other holy clothing of the age. It is evident that this is a garment meant for someone of high stature and sends a clear message to all who see him wearing it. What is not so clear is how this rule can go along the rule of shatnez. Shatnez, another biblical law, is one that forbids the mixing of fibers, like the wool and the linen specified for the Kohen Gadol's robe. The two laws are in conflict. The robe is to contain a forbidden blend of fabrics. God is supposed to be infallible and consistent. God's laws should be the same. They should be just and apply equally across the board. Then we encounter contradictions, and sometimes it seems as though the rules do not apply. What does this say about God? What does it say about our responsibilities, about justice? What values are on display when someone gets preferential treatment? This problem was not lost on the scholars of the past. Even though the two laws conflicted with one another, they were still both valid law. Those laws do not cancel each other out, but instead carve out an exception. Maimonides saw that exception as one limited by temporality. The priest could only wear that robe at a certain time. Others argued that the Kohen Gadol should have a distinct dress, a royal garment that no other person could wear. Both of these explanations say the same thing, that because the Kohen Gadol was special, The rule of Shatnez did not apply in that moment. The Kohen Gadol had duties and stature above everyone else. He needed special allowances to be able to fulfill his duty. While this might resolve the tension in a strictly legal sense, it is still deeply troubling. It appears inconsistent, as though he is getting preferential treatment or special favor. We then begin to wonder if there are other exceptions. We wonder how many other loopholes there are. We begin to doubt the rule of law. Then we think of our own needs and begin to make exceptions for ourselves. When we do that, making self-serving, prejudicial, and inconsistent exceptions, they threaten the very rule of law itself. We tell ourselves that preferential treatment might not be so bad. We learn from the Talmud the value of lefi kivodo, the idea that a person may be exempt from certain obligations if doing so would be beneath his or her dignity. Yet this is another exception. What happens when we hold someone to a different standard not for their honor, but to help ourselves? It becomes less about honoring our values and more about benefiting ourselves, often at the expense of others. What happens when the ability to skirt the rules becomes a perk of power? Abuse. Authoritarian regimes are rife with such corruption. The history books record, though, how they ended, and the world's landscape is still pockmarked with the exceptions and the excuses of dictators and tyrants, opportunists who made their own laws. We expect to see in our leaders the qualities and the values of the institutions that they run. When our nation declared its independence, the value of having one law applied equally to all, with no person above the law or above another, was a fundamental element. Our exodus from the British Empire was an acknowledgement and a fervent desire to live under the rule of law, not the rule of a king. The founding fathers and thinkers knew what tyranny looked like. They knew that the freedoms they fought for, those of expression, of religion, of the press, those were essential to a free society. They knew that freedom depended on leaders who were responsive both to the will of the people and to the rule of law. This was what James Madison called the spirit which nourishes freedom. He continued, "If this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty." Our very freedom depends on one law for all. Our laws hold our nation together. We craft them to protect everyone, enshrining equal protection in those very documents. Moves to evade our laws by relying on privilege are an attempt to circumvent what should be our shared values. They are an effort to substitute personal ideologies for public interests. We broke free from the yoke of monarchy. We have no American royalty, no nobility to reside above the commoner, and as such, we are all equally beholden to the law. From our business dealings to our taxes and our sworn oaths, we are responsible for upholding the duties and the responsibilities in our position as citizens. Those laws were drawn in blood on battlefields from Yorktown to Normandy, and the banners that waved after them embodied the values for which those men and women fought and died. Those campaigns to rid ourselves of the monarchy or to rid the world of fascism shared one common goal: the triumph of equality. The Kohen Gadol answered only to God. There was no Congress or Supreme Court to call him into question. Instead of God as counsel, arbiter, and witness, we have co-equal branches of government. Our nation has maintained that balance because people have respected the rule of law. At times, we have seen people eager for more power, whether to be shielded from accountability or looking to reserve for themselves the powers that had been delegated to another. Each time, though, balance was restored, peace maintained. Even those who had sought to amass more power did not in the end rebel, did not take up arms. They did not denigrate the officials who had ruled against them. As a result, our nation has weathered craven grabs at power, attempts to wither the other branches of government, and lingering questions as to whether those in charge of the laws broke them. Respect for the equal branches has let us live in comfort, knowing that our government continues to serve us and not its own ends. The idea that we share a fate as a nation under the law is one that is very Jewish. We stood at Mount Sinai and signed our collective futures over to God. We agreed that there would be one law, our law, all bound to it, from the lowest to the highest member of society. The American breed promised to do the same. From our first declarations, we asserted that all men are created equal. In time, we took steps not only to live out that creed, but to make it a living document that spoke to all people, men, women, children, and the strangers who reside among us. Our challenge has been to ensure that nobody is beneath the law, that we do not deny others the rights we enjoy ourselves. President Theodore Roosevelt understood this. He once declared, "No man is above the law and no man is below it. Nor do we ask any man's permission when we ask him to obey. Obedience to the law is demanded as a right, not asked as a favor." There are exceptions, of course. Presidents and politicians are afforded certain privileges, allowances that they need to do their jobs and ensure our safety. But like the ones allowed to the Kohen Gadol, they are limited. Everyone, even presidents who seek to operate above the law or exempt themselves from it altogether, do so with grave consequences for their fellow citizens and their country. If our nation is one by, for, and of the people, we must ensure that nobody can operate outside of the law. We must not allow any politician or official to abuse, nor permit any administration to impoverish us as it enriches itself. This is our duty as Americans. As Reformed Jews, it may not matter to us that the Shatnez statutes and the sartorial strictures of the Kohen Gadol are at odds with one another. We neither inspect our garments, nor do we acknowledge a priestly caste. But it does matter to us that there is injustice. It does matter that people who live by laws are not always subject to them. So as Reformed Jews, we have elevated not the laws, but our values. We are acutely aware of what happens when people live above the law. This is why Reformed Judaism has committed to the values it has. It is why Reformed Judaism has come to embrace equality. We ended the distinctions of Kohens, Levites, and Yisrael. All may be called to Torah, first or last or in between. We have opened our arms to women in the clergy. We have reduced the bars of entry while adding letter after letter from L to G to B to T to Q and beyond. We live out our ideal that no persons are created greater than their brother or their sister. Our prayer space and our religious life is egalitarian. It is why rabbis from our Reform community were among those who took up signs and prayed with their feet during the civil rights movement. As we distance ourselves from the confines of halakha, from a rule-driven religious life, from the rationalizations and legal contortions that these ancient laws have brought, we have come in search of laws that lead us instead to justice. When we lift up our eyes to see justice, where do we turn? We turn to the prophets. We turn to our values, those highest of ideals that we get from God and make a part of our lives as Jews. The prophets were the pioneers of social justice, condemning those who feigned piety while engaging in sin. Their message was not one of blind compliance with the law, but a challenge to live up to our values. Amos chastised them, "Spare me the sounds of your hymns, and let me not hear the sounds of your lutes, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream." People find ways to exempt themselves from the law, residing in places of privilege and oppressing the poor and powerless. Judaism does not condone these things, yet we find the rules that excuse our actions, the loopholes that let us look the other way, and rationalize ourselves right out of trouble. That is what stirred the prophets to action. That is what the architects of the Reform movement saw as well. Adherence to the letter of the law while violating its very spirit was no exemplar of piety. It was an exercise of the abuse of power. The psalmist affirmed, "Your command is broad beyond measure. Oh, how I love your law." We too can love the law and honor it. Only by living our values do we honor the law. Upon the founding of the first modern synagogue over 200 years ago, Israel Jacobson stated that the realities of this reform venture, there is nothing in this intent that in any way contradicts the principles of pure religion, of the demands of general morality, of reason, or of your own humanitarian attitude. The rest is commentary, but if we are bogged down in the specifics and the details of those comments and fail to live up to the teachings they illuminate, we have missed the point. For our religion thrives by living its values. That is where no person is above another, where nobody is exempt, where we do not do what is hateful and protect against others doing the same. When our laws safeguard humanity, they protect all of us. When they speak to the powerful and remind them of the needs of those who have no power, we are all represented. When they defend against the abuses and corruption of the greedy, we all receive our just portion. When no one can say that the rules do not apply to him or to her, we are all subject to the same justice. When they do not deny or subvert the values we share, we are all of the same humanity. Our shared fate means shared ideals. Abuse, pain, and bloodshed follow, though, when we lose sight of those values. We so zealously guard our values when others do not respect them because we have lived through the consequences. Our rights change, our laws are amended, but our values are eternal. We live in a world of laws. Our state, our nation, our religion, to live in a just society, we look to those laws to ensure equality. Too often, people attempt to exempt themselves from the rules in order to serve their own ends. When people place themselves above the law, the values we live are obscured. It is too easy for unscrupulous people to find ways above the law. It is nothing for them to exercise their power with impunity and cruelty. These vain narcissists and selfish opportunists serve their own values and subvert the law for their own sake. That is the weight we must carry, not that of a priestly robe. It is the weight of our own values, the weight of living within the law, holding each person to that same standard as we. But it is a weight we can drape over the shoulders of our brothers and our sisters as we walk arm in arm, and we can live our values by simply doing as the prophet Micah instructed, to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Shabbat Shalom.